10, totality which
Let
becomes
me
the
find it.
consciousness of the
Give me a
world.
second.
Hold on.
Of this particular line. This line,
Which paragraph?
on the first line.
Totality which becomes conscious world in the history of mankind.
And this is the question is, if the totality,
Which meant that the social world and the natural world were split. There was no way that you could read Lukács's History of Class Consciousness carefully without noticing that split in Lukács. He thought that the world of science, which is the world of objects, was a separate reality than social relations, and was unwilling to deal with that nature. 21, 22. Plants and animals other than we, who are I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All social being determines
That's
consciousness.
right, absolutely. But he also had a strategic reason for that. He did not want to reduce the dialectic to natural objects which he thought were introduced by Engels illegitimately. That was, if not conclusive on repudiation, that was at the very least his tentative conclusion that nature does not has different laws than social relations. Perrier is one of the great inventions of human beings.
A French invention. Yeah.
Well,
I'm
human
just
beings.
teasing.
I
I'm
thought it
just
was all
teasing.
nature. It was all
Yeah, it was all nature. It's all nature. It's all interconnected here. Yeah, just-
All right, let us start by asking you what questions you have.
truth.
Double movement?
Several million, is that what you said?
double movement. The double movement of the dialect.
Give me the page and let's read it together.
Gosh, I didn't write down this page.
What lecture is that in?
I think it's in the second lecture.
Are you talking about after the block quote?
He talks to the double movement as the movement of non-identity between the concept and the thing.
Yeah.
So part of dialectics is seeing this double movement,
Yep.
but I don't understand what exactly that double movement is.
Anybody help, Beth?
I don't have the page.
Sorry. I have a PDF and I didn't.
All right, what does a double movement refer to? The double movement of the dialectic.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
It's both the positive and negative at the same time,
Yeah,
of the same concept.
right. In the process of becoming, something new is born at the same time as the old contradictions remain, at the very least in part. That's simple, but at least for the moment we'll let that remain. But Adorno has a second meaning to dialectic, which stems, if not directly, at the very least indirectly, from Engels, which I mentioned before. Engels believed that the dialectic applied to all things, nature, whatever that might mean, and social relations, and then what the Freudian psychoanalytic answer within the human being herself. The unconscious and the conscious are a form of a double movement.
Conscious and unconscious are a form of a double movement.
Well, because part of the unconscious, according to Freud and his followers, is unknowable. But it is affective. We know the unconscious largely through its effects. Did you of course are of a different species than the rest of us, but I'll ask you as well. Did you ever ask yourself, upon having some action, why the hell did I do that?
Every day.
Of course.
If you've not had it, then you don't know what I mean, except very highly intellectualized. But anybody who has some relationship to the real world as well as to their unconscious, and I'm speaking Freudian terms right now, understands that sometimes we take action or we have reaction of which we're not aware of its origin, and that is to say at least how to analyze it without help. It's a double movement of the unconscious and the conscious. The conscious realizes it through the affect, but does not know where it comes from and what it means.
Stanley, so is the unconscious for Adorno also part of this historical movement? Because, I mean, there's a way of thinking about the unconscious as a historical, or at least a primordial substance that's
Yeah.
relatively outside of history, but it seems the dialectical way in which Adorno's thinking about it, there's also a historicity to the unconscious.
That's right. The unconscious must engage itself in the process of becoming just like the conscious, just like history generally, but we don't necessarily know in what ways it happens until it hits us upside the head. And sometimes it doesn't, and we just evolve, and we describe it to the aging process. Some of us look at the age of 40 entirely different than we did at the age of 20. Well, and these are two periods of our adulthood. But why does the aging process hit people, some people earlier than others? To explain it biologically is really a simplified reduction.
I mean, for Freud, the unconscious is basically atemporal. It knows no time.
That's
Yeah.
right.
So this is always...
Not
you
for
have to keep
Adorno.
that.
Yeah, so that's why I
All
was
things are
at the Adorno.
in the process of becoming. This is Adorno.
Right.
Freud is a Kantian, and the transition from Kant to Hegel is essentially the transition from an essence which is unchanging in Kant, but which has forms of appearance which are constantly changing, to Hegel, which regards, except at the last instance, all things as in the process of becoming, and to which Marx held his fealty, his own fealty to Hegel. Things are ever changing, which makes the problem of totality very difficult, if not impossible, to grasp unless you specify the historical moment in which this totality is perceived.
Just to add, I think it's very ambiguous again in Adorno because, later or before this in Minima Moralia, he inverts the Hegelian, preface number 20, in which Hegel announces the true is the whole, right?
Yes, Hegel
And where he says
announces
the false is the whole, Adorno inverts that. So in some ways there's an ambiguous, but
he
yeah,
says the whole, whatever that may be. He's
Yes.
not willing to say that there's a whole that it can be grasped.
right.
If there's a whole, It's a temporal, it's a historical whole. It has historicity because it can be changing even as we name it.
So the whole or totality is a reification.
Mm-hmm. To say that we can grasp the totality, it's a reification for Adorno, not for Freud, but for Adorno, it's a reification. It is a static, final moment.
The concept of mediation, that's
Yes.
in the third
That's a
lecture.
book.
I think that the third lecture, I think the third or fourth page in the PDF, it's page 40.
It's
I
actually,
think that many years ago, you tried to explain in a course on capital the concept of mediation in Marx. I remember certainly.
17, 18 in this lecture, 17 and 18 where
I'm
it's
not
talking.
sure I understand it as Adorno uses it.
Is this the third lecture?
The
Yeah, it's
third
page
lecture-
17, 18.
I don't,
Yeah.
17, 18.
It's 18, yeah. 18, he begins to define the concept,
Yeah.
and he talks about yeah. It's in the context of becoming, you know. It's in the page 18 right here. This is the Hegelian concept, right? But at the top, he talks about signifying change or alteration.
We're talking about the divine,
Yes.
the absolute.
We're talking about. I think the context is about the fixity and atemporal or eternal truth, and he's trying to break that down in terms of going to becoming and then to Hegel's concept of mediation. As
Here we get Hegel's view that mediation is a qualification of any statement. Let me give an example, which is crude but I think explicit, of mediation. We have the concept which is used in psychiatry almost universally of some form of double consciousness, right? The double consciousness is regarded as a form of illness when it takes the form of two, if not developed, at least two distinct personalities. If I say Tom, who's sitting there, has two personalities, I have to say at the same time, or tell people what I mean, is that at the moment of our understanding, what we have is this concept of the totality, which involves two or more personalities, usually two. We don't know eventually what this will be. It is not truth. It is truth taken historically. The formulation has historicity. You can take any analysis of any illness, so-called illness and find the mediation and define the mediation in the illness. And I'm going to give you another one which is far more prevalent and has its life in everyday, it has its vitality in everyday life. So-and-so died of cancer. No mediation. We don't understand by the term cancer any of its origins, its historical roots, its transformations that led to the present. We don't understand the concept of illness as in terms of its implications, because we don't study thoroughly the implications. Cancer itself is a complex, like every other, a complex illness. But natural scientists are taught, not just, there's no natural to it, to reduce causality to a simple category. Death, cancer. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, there's a passage you're reminding me of. When I find it, I'll
You
point it
find
out.
it, okay.
That you just
Well, there's a really
Pointed something out.
very nice summation at the end of lecture 3 that I think
Oh, yeah,
speaks
it's
to
a
almost
famous
everything.
summation,
And it's very good. So, but the authentically dialectical art, which you can learn from Hegel, page 25, the last section of the lecture 3, lies precisely in this: we must allow the matter to drive us beyond the merely inert individual
Yeah.
determinations, while we must still retain the capacity through the experience of the specific and the individual which we have exposed to modify that whole whose concept we must possess in order to grasp the concept of what is individual, to modify that whole in such a way that it forfeits its rigid and dogmatic character. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a modification.
yeah, yeah. And he lives across the street.
I have a recurring infected urine. They've get the doctors that I have tried, without exception, have a single diagnosis. Urine is a form of disease, the origins of which we don't know. But we know how to solve the problem, which is called antibiotics, one after another. I finally found a doctor who's at NYU, whose name is Amy, who says, you haven't got enough bacteria to warrant an antibiotic. If I give you an antibiotic, all you'll get is a couple of bacteria eliminated, but your bacteria are not infected. But take an antibiotic anyway. So I have a choice. Will I take it on the assumption that, on the proposition that it might recur, or will I not take it and wait till it recurs? That's exactly where I am now. But she's the only one that said that the bacteria itself does not equal infection. She's an infectious disease.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a very singular insight though, because if you tested the urine of 30 sample people, you would find bacteria in a significant
Number.
asymptomatic cohort. So there's a difference that every doctor knows between being colonized and between being affected.
Well, she's the only one that
Colonized
made
means
the
they're there,
differentiation.
but I might have those bacteria, but I'm colonized but not infected. In other words, I'm not. So,
Right.
I mean, that's not rocket science.
Rocket science? Why is
not-
that supposed to be difficult?
That's not a particularly unique insight in terms of microbiology. Like pregnant women get colonized urine, but you don't give them antibiotics.
I would argue that social and psychological theory is as difficult as any science there is, and that's why it's degraded in the eyes of natural science and most of the public.
I think science is a lot easier than this.
I agree with you. I'm saying that would, but what scientists have done is they've said, and you've agreed with it, not you personally, Beth. Beth doesn't agree with anything that's wrong. What science has done is done a huge job on the public. Einstein is a genius who invented the theory of relativity, which none of us can understand because it's too complicated. I heard that all my young life. Too complicated. It is not too complicated. The physics may be out of my reach right now because I don't know enough physics. But I know the basic concept, and it's not a difficult concept. And anybody can learn it. But the physicists wanted us to believe nobody can learn, and the press went along with it. The media was perfectly happy to imitate the scientists. The difference between infected and non-infected bacteria in urine is a very subtle difference. I had one urologist who told me who prescribed an antibiotic. I said, "Did you find any infection?" He said, "Not so far, but you should do it anyway. You probably are infected somewhere." That was the closest to honesty I got of the four urologists that I consulted, one of whom is called infectious disease, and the other are just called regular urologist.
There are certain issues, the same issues. I had this H. pylori, which H. pylori causes the stomach cancer, stomach ulcer.
Pylori, yeah.
A pylori. And there's a tendency among Japanese, Korean, Chinese, the rice-eating people who have that H. pylori to be in the stomach. And it doesn't necessarily cause ulcer. And depending upon the doctor who is aware of this particular the genetic factor associated with the with this particular H. pylori, doctors may say one way or the other. But again, having it being a Japanese or Korean and Chinese eating a lot of rice and then having that in your stomach doesn't mean you have the stomach ulcer. On the other hand, if you do some statistical analysis, you will begin to see why non-rice-eating population having H. pylori is most likely to be associated with the stomach ulcer. Therefore, as a doctor, it is a very good idea to prescribe the antibiotics to deal with it. That's a statistical kind of analysis which allows the doctors to give a very rational decision making based on the facts. And to the extent that these facts makes a very clear differentiation, makes it, to me, the significance of facts, which goes against some of the things that we were talking in the book, but at least, to me, it has certain validity there.
The cancer story has one more fact that can be mixed in, although not always: family history.
Yeah.
Doctors now are willing to admit that family history may have some relationship to cancer in some people, but they don't know why there's recurrence. And I spoke to a physician who was a cancer specialist, and I said, "What about psychoanalytic reasons like inwardness and eating what we call in the vernacular eating your heart out, and you can't get rid of it. You can extract the cancer from the body, the cancerous cell or lump, but unless you began to address the whole person and the society and put that person in connection to that society in a certain way, you probably are not going to have a permanent cure, which they found is now true of 85% of cancer patients last a maximum of 5 years after surgery. Not breast cancer necessarily, but lung cancer, certainly pancreatic cancer, other cancers which have to do with the vital functions of the body.
Stanley, how does what the examples you give fit? He says at the end of lecture 1,
I remember that.
positivism is not a worldview, but rather an element of dialectic.
Yes, that's right.
So it's not a rejection of positivism, but
It's a moment
moment.
of the dialectic itself. Well, what I just gave were positivist from diagnoses of illness.
Right. Let me ask you one more question. When he talks here, Adorno uses the term double movement. Is there a parallel in Carpogliani when he uses the same term?
Yeah.
Of course, in a very different context.
I thought
Would
that
that-
as I read it.
Yeah, would that be a good illustration of?
Carpo was, among other things, a historian trained as an economist. His wonderful book, which they've been trying to disprove since it came out in 1948, is called The Great Transformation. If he was Einstein in prestige, I have volume 1 copy of The Great Transformation. In hardcover, it's probably worth $3.
$3.95.
$3.95. Yes. Now, what do you think it means when Adorno says that positivism is an element of the dialectic?
And I think it's a transcendence.
Sorry?
Transcendence, isn't that a word? Or the understanding, when you try to transcend.
Transcendence.
Yeah, transcend.
In the materialist sense, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
But
It means you integrate.
I'm not as smart as you are, so please go down a little bit and say what it might mean.
So it doesn't, you don't negate, you incorporate, you integrate what you can learn from positivist science, which
There's a level of appearance and there's a level of reality.
and an appearance can be a very good initial clue to the further deeper understanding of what it is, and in a way, certain the observation may lead to the clues to underlying reality, and even though Adorno may not appreciate some of the relatively lasting causal mechanism, because he seems to say I think I agree with him about the historical nature of the causality, but it does not necessarily mean it always changes. No, there are certain things which may have relative duality in the causal mechanism. And to the extent that causality has a historical nature, even geology or the physics may have certain historicity, but in the social issues, the time span may be shorter. And during certain period in which there is a clear tendency or the causal mechanism which will show such tendency, then that using that scientific facts will be a very important in understanding.
Sure.
Yeah. And
He doesn't want to invalidate any of the achievements of natural science, even though he understands them to be linear, i.e. positivist in nature. He wants to incorporate those insights into a much larger dialectical view, which not only has historicity, but has what he calls emergence in one point, and another point, why am I blocking? Development, certainly. And it's interesting. And he also endorses the idea of Hegel, who has an absolute, which means there's an endpoint to the dialectic. He endorses Hegel as having discovered both the totality and not discovered, but brought it to light, the totality and the dialectic, and knows how to disagree with Hegel. Transcends Hegel means there's no end point. There was a big debate. Wrote a book on the end of history, the end of man. And what he meant was that democracy as an institution makes the dialectic invalid. So he restates Hegel. That what has happened is that we've achieved a totality with some glitches, about 3/4 of the earth, where where democracy has not yet been reached, but we know what it is. Not only do we know what it is, but we know how it's practiced and how it works.
What was the negation of the communist project? I mean,
Yes,
it was
of
the
course.
triumph of liberal,
That's the whole point,
liberalism.
isn't
Yeah,
Well, the negation of
Fukuyama.
any
negation of-
project beyond
right,
liberalism.
right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was,
But he may have been correct, Stanley.
yes.
About what?
He says he
may have
says
been
he.
correct. I
He
mean,
says
20
no.
years.
30 years, 30
He
years.
retracted
We all
himself.
thought it was wrong at the
1989.
time,
Yeah.
But since then,
20 years ago.
there's
No,
no,
30.
I mean, if
30.
we want to be
He
positive,
retracted
30,
the
the Gulf
statement.
War. First Gulf War.
That doesn't mean he's right.
He's right about
You could be right. It
yeah,
could be
I mean, he
correct.
could have been more right than anybody thought.
What do you
Because,
think?
I mean, who even among the so-called left advocates a radical break with modernity or liberal democratic societies? They want Sweden, or they want,
I mean, does that signify an end of history or just a malaise in thinking? Or is it one and the same?
I mean,
Well,
from
his
from the
master,
standpoint, of
Kojève,
course,
yeah.
from
The
the
C- the
standpoint
CP
of what
The
will happen in the
CPC,
future,
the
we
Communist
don't know.
Party, the
But from
Communist
the
Party
standpoint
of
how
China,
things are experienced, what is the dominant sentiment or way through which people experience the world? Seems he was pretty correct.
Or it's
The Communist Party of China,
beginning of a new
I'm just giving you an example,
era.
has been in absolute power in China since 1949. They went through what amounted to a 22-year-old guerrilla and then a more conventional war from 1927, when they were hijacked by Chiang Kai-shek. Now, that was a half a century ago or more, right?
70 years now.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, time's going,
And although the policies have changed,
Right.
the form of rule has not changed all that much, except it's deteriorated. but it's still the same in terms of political structure, not all that different from what it was in 1949. That would be a mediation on the notion that the absolute is not yet found, or that democracy invalidates the communist project. It certainly has had democracy has had a huge defeat in Russia after a very promising, although uneven, beginning after the death of the Soviet Union. But most of Southeast Asia is under one party and sometimes one person rule. With an apparatus, but
Let me ask
still.
you a question, Stanley. Who argues against democracy? Does Putin come out and
What?
say, who comes out against democracy?
Nobody.
As a concept, not many
Yeah.
people.
Nobody.
So that tells you something.
Right there.
Let's tell you something.
That tells you something.
Liberal
Because we can
democracy
argue-
is still an aspirational model.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is the use of the word itself. That's what is questioned. Democracy, as you say, aspirational model is good, but the way we use is not that aspirational model. The way we use the word is referring to republic.
Exactly. That's not a democracy. Fukuyama's talking about a republic. He's calling it a democracy.
Exactly. So
There is no democracy in liberal society.
in the world.
That's beside the point. We
Yeah,
can all
right.
agree on that.
Right,
So
we're all in
agree
agreement
on that.
there.
But
Yeah.
the point is, whatever they call democracy goes unchallenged
Right,
on the
right.
level of ideas.
Have ideas.
We can all agree
Right.
that it's,
Yeah.
we can do an imminent critique and say,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
look,
yeah, of course.
in the United States they claim to have democracy, but they shoot black people every other day, so obviously something is going wrong.
But that's
so
not
down
the
the
end of
line.
history,
But
but
from
the beginning.
the notion of the end of history is on the level of ideas, not on the
Yes.
level of empirical.
But if we use Gramsci's philosophy, it doesn't make sense. Gramsci wouldn't be worried at all. Gramsci would say this is just a temporary change in the war position. It doesn't mean anything.
Well, I think it means something. I'm not saying we should be worried. We should be maybe terrified more than anything else. But the question is, maybe he was much more correct than anyone assumed, because even 30 years later, or 20-something years later, there are no ideas on the political horizon to challenge the hegemony of bourgeois democracy or liberalism or whatever you want to call it.
Or witness the names of the books, the people we follow. The Communist Hypothesis by the idea of communism, Duinzus and Zizek, etc. It's never really a practical,
The
it's
communist
always
horizon.
the communist horizon.
So it's all
Yeah,
just
yeah. So
Our
this
friend
is all,
Duinzus himself.
yeah. I mean,
Chapter-
in a way, a
Thing
kind of
about
Hegelian reaction, an antithetical moment to Fukuyama, but at the same time, only on the level of idea, hypothesis, and horizontal thinking. I mean, this is, I think, very, very important to keep in mind.
It
Not
turns
that we're
out,
disagreeing
however,
about.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, but, yeah.
It turns out that the Kurds, at least one faction of the Kurds, are practicing a version of communism.
Yeah.
That is to say, collective, or as Marx would call it, communal property. There's no profit system, and they're doing agriculture and other kinds of manual trades, and they're surviving, and they're fighting. And that's the part of the Kurds that the Obama administration and the Trump administration agree. Get rid of them. We don't want to support them. But Obama was not going to bomb them or incinerate them. But we don't know what Trump will do.
They would have the church do it. They wouldn't do it themselves.
Good point.
What else did you get out of these chapters? I don't
But
get it.
again, I think it was a very interesting discussion in the sense that, you know,
A lot
we're
of
talking
things.
about a teleological moment of the dialectic versus the open-endedness, and we're talking about closure and representation versus, again, reopening something. And this is really the dialectic we face, you know, to go back to the dual movement. You know, for the Hegelian, you know, such as a Fukuyama, who's a very dogmatic Hegelian, which Kojève, his master, became too. Kojève says communism's been effective in the United States. Everybody's got the goods. This is what he said late in his life. I mean, honestly, this is what he said. And there are two possibilities in terms of hegemony: the animal American and the snobbism of the Japanese. These were the two moments for him after. So, you know, I think we should.
That's a very good framing, I think.
Yes, it is, yeah. And he also talked about the Latin Empire
Somebody
against,
said to me as we walked into this room that it was very difficult, very hard. What was hard about it? What problems did you have?
Well, just in terms of structure, there are a lot of long sentences or run-on sentences.
Long sentences in this?
Yes.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Number two.
Adorno thinks in paragraphs,
Okay.
not in sentences.
Yeah,
He
they're
thinks in paragraphs.
paragraph
It's a good
length
thing to
sentences.
keep in mind. He thinks in
Long
paragraphs.
paragraphs, and three, very few examples.
Yeah, there's like one example where he refers to a student of social
Yeah.
sciences
Right.
who in order to understand the whole has to look at the particular, but then he says that the particular also contains the whole.
Yeah.
That was the only example he uses. I could have used a lot more examples of what,
Well, me too, and I think if you get into any kind of niche profession or whatever, if you're a doctor, you have certain languages. If you're an accountant, you write a certain way. If you're an economist, if you're not interested, if you're not familiar, you don't read a lot of philosophy, it's hard for me.
Don't need a lot of philosophy. What do you mean by that?
If you
If you
don't,
don't
read,
read it.
a lot of philosophy.
Well, he makes a lot of references to, certainly to Hegel, but also to Kant and
Well, yeah, but if you haven't read Hegel or Kant within the last 50 or 60 years, there aren't references for me.
right. No, that I mean, me too. I had to like think back on Kant.
I don't know, Plato gives examples, and even Hegel has examples of an unhappy consciousness, or whatever. You know what he means by that, because he's talking about somebody caught between Stoicism and religiosity, Christianity.
But my story has some kind of a semi-happy ending. I come to class and I have a better idea of what I read through this exchange.
In Lordship and Bondage, which is a chapter on the phenomenology of the spirit or mind, Hegel says, I think almost for the first time, in any kind of authoritative statement, that the bondsman, i.e. the working class of whatever it might be, the feudal bondsman, the capitalist bondsman, the bondsman can achieve through experience, as you're not going to do much reading, an understanding of their own oppression and of the limitations of what their understanding will give them in the real world. But his statement is, but they cannot, he didn't say they will not, he said they cannot achieve real freedom.
Yeah, freedom. Without risking life.
Without risking life. In other words, in order to be a genuine person who can capture freedom, you have to be willing to risk life. And very few, even in Europe where you have socialist and communist parties all over the place, even in Europe, you've only had episodic revolutionary upsurges, Russia being the most successful. The German upsurge of the Spartacist League failed. The earlier German Revolution failed. The Hungarian Revolution had 133 days of a communist government and then collapsed beneath the battery of the established forces, which didn't disappear. But in places like France, where you had a revolution, it was a bourgeois revolution, and then you had a Paris Commune of 1871, and you had May 1968. The body of the masses, as they are called in Europe, did not achieve freedom. It gave up for higher wages and for a better contract. I mean, it was a
Paris Commune?
Not the Commune. The Commune was smashed. Made a mistake.
The Rothschilds pulled the plug.
They made a bad decision.
One mistake it made is it did not and let the parts of the army go back in exile without cracking them up. They could have done it at one point. But the May '68 thing was avoidable.
They went for the elections, Stanley. They went for elections.
For
Charles
election.
de Gaulle outsmarted them.
Among other things.
Certainly did.
Democracy.
Yeah, once again.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right.
Exactly.
Yes,
we
Arthur.
we can speculate that the introduction of social democracy in social democratic parties in Germany, like Bernstein that we talked about 2 weeks ago, essentially neutered, so to speak, Western Marxism. Because in Russia, people were willing to die in large numbers, even before the revolution. It was very clear that you kind of have to risk your life in order to do that kind of politics. Whereas I think in the decisive moments in the West, it didn't happen.
Well, they're willing to risk their lives just on the other side.
Right. But they weren't willing to risk their lives.
With the police, with the
They weren't
police,
willing to risk
with
their
the
lives
assistance of the
for the
police.
To
revolutionary
pull the rope,
politics.
it was just for the other side.
That's a big weakness in the Western revolutionary tradition.
Well, one of the immediate questions is how come the German working class gave up its revolutionary fervor in behalf of incremental reform as outlined by Edward Bernstein in 1899 in his book Evolutionary Socialism, and by Max Adler and by many others, including Frederick Engels, who never renounced revolution but held out hope that through elections they could gain substantial improvements, which they did for a while. But how do you account for that?
The least risky of the two choices.
Yeah. They refused, the working class refused to, and the students who worked with them refused to risk life. Well, in the old term, the life and death struggle for liberation. Life and death, meaning you could die, or to basically pick up the gun, even after these huge demonstrations and occupations of the entire city of Paris and Marseille. They took over the two cities. that were the most important ones in France. It raises very significant questions of which there have been relatively few attempts to provide answers. Why does the working class and advanced, and the more developed it is, more developed the country, renounce either tacitly or overtly the Hegelian notion of risky life, which Marx was entirely in favor of. You had a socialist party in France that held government power for a good part of the end of since the end of the Second World War, and still did until this last guy came into power, and he's, if anything, not transcendent on any level. And the communists were no paragons of revolutionary growth in France. The Labour Party, founded in 1900 in England, never had the aspiration to take power by risk, if necessary, but to enter the parliamentary system and play the game, which it still does. Left, right, or center. Another way of putting it in Britain is, how is a Tony Blair possible? I mean, it's a significant question.
Peter's good on the English, he can explain it.
Explain it, please.
I thought he was a Tory.
Carpogliani, going back to our friend the double movement. If you remember in the Great Transformation, he says the place where the capitalist class has been the most vicious is in Britain.
Right.
And it's so vicious that, in effect, the working class has become another race. The oppression was so acute and so severe that it is as if they were another race of people and are completely incapable of self-guided political organization. That was his diagnosis of the situation in Britain.
So, Peter,
So
does it
far, there
take,
has been no evidence to the contrary.
does it take the wretched of the earth to make the
No, it
revolution?
doesn't take the wretched of the earth. The more wretched, the more incapable, in some ways.
So that
Doesn't
means
take
that
the wretched of the earth.
the violence has to be even greater, projected by the revolutionary movement, to undo this kind of situation. And now that makes sense what happened in Russia or in China after the revolution. That was the necessity. The violence had to be that severe.
Look, when I moved to Manchester, I had read that book, before, and I never took it all that seriously. But then I realized, walking the streets of, what used to be, the working class area of Salford, which had become, no, not gentrified, had become, slums. That there was a physical, you could see. Here, in New York, if someone is dressed or, and has their hair cut and so forth, you can't necessarily tell their class origins. If you, clean somebody up, put nice clothes on them, you won't be able to tell. There, just looking at the face, it was so severe you could tell the difference between the former working classes and the bourgeoisie. So I think there is something to the argument, and certainly the idea that they're incapable of self-guidance. Now, maybe they're not the only ones. We shouldn't single them out, but
Does everybody understand the salience of the distinction between the totality, regardless of whether it's Hegelian, and positivism?
Positivism.
You do understand it?
Positivism?
Positivism. Positivism can be regarded as an element of the dialectic, but has been raised by its proponents to the level of the totality. Now, this is all there is, or what Marx and Hegel would call immediacy. All we have are the facts, as proven and disproven by science.
Which is in Adorno's first lecture here.
Yeah.
And Peter
Facts, but
read
with thought.
the conclusion to that positivism is not a worldview, but rather an element of dialectic, which is an attack on, you know.
I think he's very truthful on the
yeah,
one hand. On the other hand,
Yeah.
that's not the way it's taken.
Right.
And in
Right.
lecture 3, he's saying that
But,
in lecture 3, he's saying that positivism is essentially a first determination,
Yes.
or a first meaning.
Yeah.
yes.
It's taking things themselves. It's approaching the things themselves, right? As
Right.
a starting point almost.
And as an immediate, non-reflective
Yeah.
thing. And one of the reasons it stays in the Hegelian dialectic, I think, is because of the Aufhebung. You know, you're suppressing, lifting to a higher plane in this transcendence that Tom was referring to. But at the same time, you're retaining that element and that layer of the immediacy that can come back again and either haunt the totality or be, again, overcome or confronted. Yeah, I think, yeah.
So the question
Yeah.
here is that.
Which is part of the movement, yeah.
In order to have that, before the real transcendence, you need to have the grasp, scientific grasp, and with so the omitting that understanding of facts is a problematic in dialectics. You have to go through that, right? You have to know that the what positivist or positive science talks about the substance or the matter before you transcend. And here it seems to me that the purpose of dialectics is pretty normative or ethical. It's really, you know, going beyond that what it is that we are facing. First, we have to understand that substance or the matter, that what it is we are facing in reality. And then what I find a little problematic is this kind of a very negative understanding of the being. Because that is where the focus of this the positive science. And yet, that in the dialectics, it seems to me that's a starting point. And if you don't get that, then you will never go beyond it. And then that means, you know, a treating being in a way Adorno is doing seems a little problematic. Being seems kind of second thought.
What do you mean by negative understanding of being? As in negativity as method, or you're talking
In terms
about like a
of
moralistic?
treating being as something not to be, you know, the being becomes almost like, this is my perception. Because the focus is becoming, the being becomes the moment, the focus of this something concrete, and it seems it's something which needs to be.
In the movement, the being already becomes something else the moment that
Yeah.
you say it's already frozen.
Yeah.
though.
I
It's
think,
already-
I think he's only saying that because he's summarizing Hegel.
Yeah.
I think later in the lectures, he's gonna, Adorno's gonna offer his, I think what he's doing in the beginning, 5 lectures, 3 lectures, is his summary of Hegel. So I
Okay.
think we're reading That's the way I understand it.
Okay.
So we're essentially
Yeah, I haven't
reading
read the
Hegel's,
further.
we're reading Hegel's Dialectics to
Yeah.
Adorno,
Yeah.
and then we're going to get to Adorno's
Okay.
sort of magicians.
Okay.
Like a good germ, you know. This is not American
Listen.
philosophy.
Listen,
Philosophy should help to avoid
It
us
says in the
becoming
back- it
stupid.
says in the back-
He says that in the first
Adorno's
lecture.
abiding suspicion
Yeah.
of easy communicability.
Could I make a comment on my understanding of how he treated positivism? I think what I understood, sorry, I've only read once, not 3 times. So. Sorry. But my understanding.
That's the Japanese snobism
Speaking of snobbism. But what I understood is that I think he's not against with the positivism as long as we can understand how positivism itself can internalize the contradictions. The point I'm trying to make is, I was sorry, I couldn't remember this particular passage, but when he was describing the conventional understanding of dialectic, that is, there's a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
well, that would be one example.
Yeah, but I thought he was very interesting because he tried to find the antithesis within the thesis. It's not so much about you pose A over
Yeah.
B,
Yeah.
but there is some contradiction within the A.
Right.
And then I
Yeah.
thought that's
And-
how he tried to understand the positive at the same time. Like the knowledge that you perceive through the positive, it doesn't mean that it's a fact. It internalizes various
Right.
contradictions.
Right. And,
So,
yeah. And as we know from Heidegger, the ground problems of phenomenology, a positivism comes from the verb to posit, to take a position. And the antithetical is also taking another position outside, another posit. So if you start to think of it this way, it begins to, I think, make more sense. It's not just the accumulation of facts or this kind of stuff. Yeah, and
Sorry,
this- yeah, no, it's, I thought you opened it up well.
So that's what. Can
Yeah,
I?
yeah,
ask
number
one
two.
more? Number 2 question.
Number 2.
It's the question of suffering, suffering versus happiness. And he was referring to that towards the end of the lecture, 5th lecture, and. I was really struck by the word suffering because when I read the estranged labor for the Marxist, the manuscript of 1844, he described, I think, labor of a human as a way of suffering. So I wonder if there's a relation between this text with the Marxist 1844 manuscript in the term of suffering or labor. Sorry, it's not very articulated question.
He will over the length of these 20 lectures range pretty widely. One of the things, however, that you got to realize is that there's a lot to be covered. He'll do some better and more distinctly than others. But I would like to stay closer to the first 5 lectures.
Okay.
The problem that he continually returns to in all of the lectures is the problem of the totality. Let me give an example of the totality in American history. There's a work by a historian named Saint, S-A-I-N-T. The work is called The Story Has Never Been Told. Michael, you know about Tyrus.
You mean Edward Baptist?
Baptist,
Baptist, yeah, he is a kind of saint, yes.
Yeah, Baptist.
Saint Baptist. I see the slip there.
Yeah, that was a
Good.
problem.
Yeah, okay.
Edward Baptist. And he's got a claim that you have to dig pretty hard to realize. His claim has got a double feature. The most evident one, the one that is on the surface, it's a 500-page treatment of slavery. Slavery is at the heart of the dynamic of the development of American capitalism in various ways. And the second part of it, which is much less evident but has to be explained when asked the question, why is he going so deeply into slavery when everybody knows that slavery stinks, is that he's making the argument that today, as well as then, capitalism actually survives in the United States and grows on the prohibition of black freedom. That black slavery and black freedom slavery is still in effect, if not in the letter of slavery, which is that you're owned by somebody else, in that you are confronted by chains that prevent you from going further if you're black. And the numbers of people who actually end up going black, as sanctified by, he doesn't say this, sanctified by Richard Milhouse Nixon, is defined by the affirmative action program, which takes a handful of blacks and gives them an opportunity to become system intellectuals, capitalist system intellectuals, even if they're on the cutting edge of civil rights. They're asking for rights within capitalism. And that slavery is the engine. Without it, it wouldn't happen. And the point, capitalism wouldn't happen. He says that at one point, flatly.
Says what?
Capitalism would not happen without slavery. American capitalism.
Especially the growth of the U.S. capitalism.
I don't mean capitalism in its existence. He meant the growth of and the dominance of capitalism worldwide.
Unlike the Industrial Revolution in England, you know, the United States experience was much more based on slavery, outright slavery. It was crucial to the development of American capitalism. And to the degree to this,
Sorry?
Who was that?
A book
His
by
name is-
Baptist.
His name is Edward Baptist. He's a historian at
Baptist.
Cornell University.
Cornell University. He's 48 years old. This is his second book. Came out in 2014. It's available in paperback. Well, I bought it in paperback. But there is an example of somebody who goes in and through the positivist take on American history, 19th century, 18th century, 19th century history, to come up with a conclusion that's much, much larger. That this is where American capitalism developed.
And dismantles work at the Chicago School, Time on the Cross, who won Nobel Prizes for their work on this.
I could give you one more example.
In Chicago, you studied slavery
One more
from a
example.
positivistic
If you
standpoint,
take the trouble to read the leading histories of the New Deal, which begins in 1933. The leading one of the leaders is Arthur Schlesinger Jr. 1,000 Days, Coming of the New Deal. You would come up with the conclusion Roosevelt made the New Deal.
And that Kennedy needed a brain trust, of which he was part of, right? The author.
Yeah, but he was a latecomer. But he has written the history of the New Deal the way it's supposed to be written from the point of view of the rulers. And if you read that history differently, from another perspective, from the perspective of the workers, of the starving, bankrupt farmers, of the primarily Mexican migrants, you'll come up with a different history. A different history.
You know, our friend Rhonda Levine,
What'd you say?
our friend
Rhonda
Rhonda
Levine.
Levine wrote the book, Red Class Struggle
Yeah.
and the New Deal.
Yeah.
Ron Levine's book.
Explanation.
Rhonda did that.
Yeah.
This is not that different in some ways. Otherwise, it's much more detailed. Rhonda Levine teaches at Colgate. She wrote a people's history, basically, of the New Deal in a way that Baptist tries to do. They are not going to get Nobel Prizes. They're not going to get Pulitzer Prizes, probably. I mean, we're doing this kind of thing.
Not even the Lenin Prize.
Not even, yeah. Especially since.
That tells you a story in and of itself.
You never know with Putin, though, you know, maybe reinstitute the
He was smart, yeah.
yes.
He is smart, but
He is smart. Yeah.
But the question about totality, which makes it very, very difficult for me,
What's
is that
difficult?
Edward Baptist's understanding of American capitalism being impossible without slavery.
Not that.
Well,
not,
it's
not
growth.
capitalism.
It's growth. It's
But capitalist
exponential
dominance.
Yeah.
growth is impossible without
That's
king
right.
cotton, sugar, et cetera, et
But
cetera.
once
that-
you
that
understand
spoils it.
totality in a different way, like post American Road to Capitalism, try to use the political Marxism, agrarian origin of capitalism, trying to understand the New England sort of petty commodity production, and then how the capitalism in New England, capitalism in mid-Atlantic, are very, very different from the slavery in the South, and the post-understanding of the American capitalism really creates a very different.
Baptist's point is different. This
Yeah.
is part of the whole point of the other half that's
All
never
right,
been told.
let's
But
st-
please, yeah.
Here's what argument he is engaging. The development of American capitalism was signified by the startling success of its industries, of its manufacturing industries, the most prominent of which for several centuries, and even into the late 19th century, was textiles. The whole textile industry and its global prominence of cheap goods is based on slavery. Without the cotton industry in the South, which was a slaveholders' industry, America would have been at best a second-rate power. But what happened, of course, is that slavery became a huge element of capitalist development. And I think what he is doing, in effect, is taking issue with all of the major takes on how capitalism developed. Here's a textile industry and our industry without slavery, or slavery is a minor aspect of it. It's not true, he says. Slavery is the heart of this.
But even if that is the case, this is the problem of the totality, I think. If we begin to understand totality as a flat total, which seems to me problematic, instead, trying to understand wholes or the layered totality, and then try to understand, okay, there's a certain capitalist development, agrarian capitalism, which developed.
We know the Eastern agrarian capitalism.
Yeah, and then the agrarian capitalism, not in the UK, but agrarian capitalism in US, and then how that particular mechanism, capitalist development mechanism, may be conceived, understood at that, sort of as a development. And once you understand that, as opposed to this, trying to connect everything to totality, slavery was important, clearly. But without understanding that underlying distinction between certain layers of totality, which includes slavery versus which doesn't include slavery, we begin to have a very murky understanding of the relationship between different wholes. And this is where I have some, because I think the totality as everything connected to everything else, and therefore we can only look at totality in this flat whole. I have a problem with that.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
In order to legitimate your point, however, you would have to do and he argues this, not about slavery, but about anything. You have to do specific studies of political, economic studies, as well as cultural studies of northern agrarian, small area capitalism, and the slave economy and its relationship to global trade. Right. And I think what would be lacking in Baptist, which he doesn't care about because he wants to make a point, there's a polemic built into every page of this book, is that the ignorance of slavery and its relationship to that development is mortal. It's mortal because it eliminates what really was at the core, which means that it doesn't necessarily follow that he ignores northern capitalism, he ignores agrarianism generally, but that he was trying to make a point about what would be called in the old language the principal contradiction. The principal contradiction between the form of labor and the form of exchange. The exchange relations are entirely capitalist exchange relations. The form of labor is entirely slavery. And that goes very far to explaining what happened in development. No, but you're right. That wasn't his purpose. But what is interesting is the exclusion. But he talks about that in the introductory chapter, what you just talked about. It's the exclusion of slavery as a motivating force for the whole system. And the worst, not the conservatives, they ought to be expected of what they do. The worst is Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and his ilk, which is the liberals. Schlesinger Jr. was a liberal. And we have so many leftists who think that liberalism is their ally. And he doesn't. It's clear. It would have to be undone by revolt, not by votes. But it is true.
Hopefully that's Mike Pence.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just sorry. I was just making a referential look. I said I hope it's Mike Pence they're taken to the hospital. Forget Trump. We got to go to the line of succession quickly.
It gets pretty deep.
It does. I've done the calculations. The ages and everything. Applied certain algorithms to it. We're in deep shit,
I'm against Trump's assassination. I'm against Trump's funneling of 14-year-olds as a basis for throwing him out of office, because behind Trump is Mike Pence.
Right, that's right.
You gotta be very careful what you wish for.
Right, indeed. And behind Mike Pence is Paul Ryan. Behind Ryan is Rogers, right? Or is it Rogers and then Ryan?
That's right.
The Supreme Court, Chief Justice. Yeah, and then Ryan, I think, or
Roberts.
Ryan or Rogers.
Roberts.
Either one.
Roberts.
I mean, you gotta go a long
Right.
way.
It's a deep bench.
Yeah.
Stanley, I'm sorry. No.
One of the things that we should actually introduce here is the attempt by people like Karotani, a Japanese scholar, Marxist scholar, to reintroduce Kant into the Marxist equation. And if you had had not a repudiation of that view, but a severe contest with that view, you have to go to Adorno. It's the concept of the essence, the unchangeable essence, which is in Kant, that Adorno is challenging. That you have all of these contradictions and all of these variables, as would be described by positivists, yes, they're all very important, but Kant in the last instance wants to establish an essential nature of reality, which is unchangeable and unchanging, which underlies all of this turmoil. And the book is called Dialectics?
Trans-critique.
Trans-critique,
Plays on
Marx
Kant.
and Kant.
Yeah. Both is a critique of reason and a critique of political economy is the dual nature of critique.
I think that what now characterizes Marxism as a whole, HOLE,
Oh. Clever.
is a version of positivism. It focuses and reduces everything to the categories of political economy. Not that the work that they do in the critique of political economy is worth less. It's an element of the dialectic, but it is just an element. But people have basically accepted the idea that culture is superstructure, that political affairs are transitory and are not subject to real study. The state is coming under more scrutiny, but the political economists are not among them. Specialization, and this would go for Baptists as well, specialization is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And you notice how Adorno continually criticizes the philosophers. He is talking philosophy, he is a philosopher. But he thinks the philosophers have basically gone in the wrong direction. In order to do the materialist dialectic, you have to be as knowledgeable, and I don't say in great detail, but you have to at least be as knowledgeable in the cultural, political affairs as you are in political economy. And when you do cultural stuff and you do political stuff, you have to bring in the political economy and the political stuff and the culture and so on. And in political economy, you have to bring in the culture. And they don't do it. And the reason they don't do it is pretty clear. One, it's the Marxist tradition itself, which has become overly specialized. And the other is you don't get a job if you're too smart in the field.
That happened to Marx, you know. Yeah. Get a job.
I got a job, and I got another job at the Graduate Center of the City University on a false promise. The false promise was that I was a labor expert, and that would feed into the sociological.
You only worked a few years. How could you be an expert?
I'm a labor expert. I wrote a book, and I wrote articles, and when I started to get interested in art and cultural life and politics, in some ways, I became an outsider to the people who hired me. They felt betrayed.
Even though it was out, you were not hired on the basis of the crisis of the historical material.
I certainly wasn't. And the crisis of historical materialism
Or hysterical
came earlier
materialism.
than my hiring. I got hired
Right.
in '83,
Right.
but it was on the strength of false promises.
Right.
They thought I was a labor expert.
How is it that you got hired at Columbia as a political theorist?
I was not hired. I was a visiting professor. Where they wanted to think about hiring me, so they asked me to sort of try out. And we came to mutual agreement. That
You
wasn't
mean
my
you
cup of
agreed to
tea.
disagree about?
I've watched innumerable, that's too many, but many historians especially, and political scientists at Columbia who start out as Marxists, and I use that word in quotes, who end their career, and that is true of Eric Foner particularly, but I can name more, as liberals, as left liberals, who want to study the Constitution and its uses. Not that the study is wrong, but it's limited. Eric just retired. No cause for celebration, because I don't think the history department of Columbia, as is presently constituted, will do better. It's a real problem. And this guy, Baptist, is almost singular in this discussion of 16th to late 19th century slavery and its consequences. It's amazing. There was more 40, 50 years ago than there is today. Not that it was empirically as complete as Baptist, but there was a lot of conversation. Genovese, Fredrickson, and several more fairly prominent historians studied slavery and Reconstruction. Foner himself wrote a rewrite of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, in America. It was quite a book, Du Bois's book, and Eric made it much more palatable, but at the same time it was a useful contribution. But since then, and that was in the early 1980s, he has written about liberty and civil liberties and civil rights, and that's okay. And if you look at Amy Goodman, the Democracy Now! Show, it's all about civil liberties and civil rights. And I'm for civil liberties and civil rights. That's not the problem. The problem is brains after brains are being exhausted in the same argument. women's civil rights, black civil rights in general.
Should be for uncivil rights now. We should throw civil
I
society
just
into
want to
question.
quote Adorno here. I think
Yeah,
Stanley's going to like
yeah,
it.
yeah.
It says,
What page are you on?
page 3 says, philosophy should help us to avoid becoming stupid.
Yeah.
And of course he quotes Hegel immediately, and he says, Hegel in a conversation with Goethe once described the dialectic as the organized spirit of contradiction. You know, it's interesting, sometimes when you read the actual like primary sources, they're like infinitely clearer than the secondary sources, you know, unless they're Adorno, you know, who kind of steps aside and like knows when to quote sort of the better expression. I mean, I think this is an important part of his writing as sort of a great thinker, which is he knows when to quote Hegel and when to sort of, you know, paraphrase Hegel because he's disagreeing with him. But he is saying philosophy should fundamentally help us avoid becoming stupid, and I wonder if because philosophy is also stupid today, like in a sense that at the CUNY Graduate Center, right, Stanley? Like I took a few classes in philosophy and it was like, you know, if Stanley ate an apple and Michael drank tea, then, you know...
I'm glad to see we're in truth tables now. We're in truth tables? That's good.
Is
Yeah.
that a truth statement? I mean, this is what they were studying. You know, hundreds of philosophy students were wasting their time on like, incredibly obvious sort of things. And like, how are we going to write about history and slavery if our philosophy is so poorly, you know?
And Wittgenstein is eminently more clear than Hassel Kripke is, too, who was your, you know, the big name there.
In the 60s, Marcuse described America as the moronization of America. And that was going on. And this was at the eve of the mass anti-war movement, which it turned out burnt itself out after Nixon was right. Eliminate the draft and institute
Smartest move they made.
voluntary
in the last 50 years.
Enlistment, and you'll smash the anti-war movement. And it happened.
That's why we'll never have a
slavery.
draft. We'll never
Yes.
have a draft.
That's slavery.
That's right. We created a new kind of slavery.
New kind of
That's right.
slavery.
New kind of slavery, exactly.
That's right.
Involuntary servitude.
Verbs of voluntary servitude, exactly.
You think he read Marcuse, Stanley, when he came up with that?
What did you say?
It's
You were reading
Kissinger reading.
Marcuse,
Kissinger reading his
Kissinger.
German compatriot.
But I think,
No, this is Marcuse is after Adorno.
but again, I think they are reading Marcuse. I think, you know that the Israeli military
Well,
leadership is
that's a
reading
different
Deleuze.
story, yeah.
So if the Israeli military is reading Deleuze, there's no reason why Nixon didn't read Marcuse. I think we have to assume that these people read everything we read.
Well, Battle of Algiers
Yeah.
is the
I
most
would
popular
assume that.
movie in the Pentagon. That I know. That's fact.
What was it called?
Yes.
Battle of Algiers. It's kind of a long movie for you, though.
2 hours, 125 minutes of attention
I know it is.
span.
Short attention span.
What was it
Kill,
called?
kill.
Battle of Algiers, you know it.
Ah.
I read he was smoking in that.
As wrong-headed as it was very inspiring.
It's a classic. Just a little long for Panama.
Marx was very ambivalent about colonialism. It educated a whole new class of intellectuals who built the socialist movement in India. And then they became social democrats and all but collapsed. There's nothing else that you got out of this, right? Let me just issue a warning. Every event, every movement of history, every event of history has a multiplicity of participants and of elements. They're never two elements. They're never just three, even in most cases. and I speak both in the natural world and in the social world. Inevitably, the investigator has to pick out which of these is the most salient for explaining what is going on. Remember this. Trump does not deny an overwhelming event like what happened in Houston or what happened in Florida. What he does deny is that there is a change in the climate on a long-term basis that will eventually, if not confronted, sink millions of people into the mud. He is not stupid. At least his advisors aren't stupid. Maybe Bannon. They're not denying that there is, they see it. Somebody said they do read what we read. That is true. Not necessarily Trump himself, but people around him. And now what we've seen is disaster after disaster and bigger and more frequent demonstrations against the administration's refusal to undertake to join the worthless Paris Accord. That's more symbolic than it is real. And second, to actually acknowledge climate disaster, or climate, which is really much more important as a phrase than climate change. Climate change is simply a descriptive. It could be any kind of climate change, but climate disaster means that the climate is increasingly in trouble, and so are we. But those demonstrations, which are now 25 years old, and individual scientists and social scientists and citizens who come to the conclusion that doing something is imperative, have not yet produced in the United States a movement to supersede Bill McKibben, who is the resident Social Democrat. He leads a 100,000 person march here in Manhattan.
On 10th Avenue.
What?
It's on 10th Avenue.
Yeah.
Doesn't even bring attention to itself.
And it's all marginalized.
Lincoln Tunnel.
We went on a February 15th, 2003 march. How many people were on that march against the Korean War?
Well,
It was against the Iraq, but
Oh.
you got the new one coming, Stanley. It's all right.
Participating.
There's your
leaders,
dialectic, there's your dual movement
but
right
the
there.
leaders of that march, some of whom were in the Communist Party, which is not a left-wing organization anymore, in my view, never bothered to follow up by building an institution that can actually carry the fight further. That's what the nature of the beast is today. Event after event after event, disconnected with each other by any kind of follow-up and any kind of mobilization that can be organized on a wider basis. And so, for all intents and purposes, there is no environmental movement in the United States at the time when this is the most clear and present danger to human life and animal life and all living things, as it were, so to speak. It's very interesting.
With both those marches, there were massive marches, and I was really impressed by, and you get hopeful on these massive
We're all
marches.
hemmed in by police agreement.
Yeah, but at the end, where you emptied out, I think the first one was in Washington Square Park, I don't remember. But there was nothing there. You just go home. There was no like
Right.
places to like
Right.
hook up into a movement, get literature. No.
There's no politics.
It's just like
That's
go
the
home.
problem.
You know, it was a great day,
No
wasn't it? Go
politics.
home.
That's it. Okay. For next week,
Yeah.
6 to 10.
I have a question
And
for you.
listen.
Have you ever read Eichendorff? Who he mentions?
Yeah, listen.
I mean, I'm just wondering. I never read Eichendorff.
Please write down your questions and bring them to class. If you hear the question repeated, you don't have to do that. But if you have a question that has not been answered, or when I ask for questions, please be ready to answer the question, to give your questions. Because that's what generates discussion.
Just to go back to what Arto was saying, how clear Adorno is, if you go to just page 2, you know, the last paragraph on page 2, it gives you an incredibly good working set of definitions on the dialectic. Is indeed a method which refers to processes of thinking, but it also differs from other methods insofar as it constantly strives not to stand still, constantly corrects itself in the presence of the things themselves. And we could define dialectic as a kind of thinking that does not content itself merely with the order of concepts, but rather undertakes to correct the conceptual order by reference to the being of the objects themselves, which you were talking about in terms of this dialectic of nature as well, that Adorno is somehow, you know, bridging this gap that Lukács leaves as a dualism, you know, the social and the natural. Right? And the vital nerve here leaves in this movement of moment of opposition. Dialectics is a reverse of what is generally taken to be, rather than being simply an elaborate conceptual technique. It is the attempt to overcome all merely conceptual manipulation, which is something I think we were talking about earlier about the medical profession and sometimes the scientific, you know, in terms of how they work with, you know, facts. To sustain at every level the tension between thought and what it would comprehend. Dialectic is the method of thinking which is not merely a method, but the attempt to overcome the merely arbitrary character of method and to admit into the concept that which is not itself concept.
And here, I think, is
please.
what we were talking about in the
No,
federal
you don't think it's clear?
meeting. So it's not like Lukács said in the early Lukács that dialectic is just a method.
Right.
But it admits into the concepts that which is not itself concept, and that's basically Marx. That's the mediation that
Yes.
Marx uses
Right.
from Hegel to explain the movement of capital. So if we don't understand that, we can't understand. Like I sat through David Harvey's lectures on capital, and the word mediation was not mentioned a single time because he doesn't really understand that. I mean, he talks about it in his written lectures, but there was no discussion of mediation from Hegel through Marx on how capital functions. The transformation of abstract labor, or the transformation of money invested as capital, right, into the commodity that is necessary for the production of the new commodity, which is then converted into valorized capital. These are exactly when one concept, when capital becomes, or when the commodity intrudes into the capital itself, which is then transformed yet again and again and again, and that's, I think, very important for Marxists.
Well, I think that his famous, Lukács, his famous chapter in History and Class Consciousness is pretty good on that issue.
On mediation,
The chapter on
Mediation,
reification.
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Lukács, of course,
Yeah.
focused on this as well.
Right.
And when
But-
Harvey discusses cities, for example, that's a mediation. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't have to use the word to be discussing mediation.
I don't know. Sometimes I think it's important to use the word because the word has this meaning.
I don't disagree with that. Read the chapter on working class, so-called working class consciousness. The long one that's 100 pages. And see if you don't encounter mediation as a concept explicitly. I think
In
you
what
will.
book?
It's in history of class consciousness.
Oh, in the Lukács.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, in Lukács, not in-
reification
Yeah.
in the class
Not in-
consciousness of the proletariat. It's the second part, yeah.
But I think Stanley's making an important point here, in addition to like when you made the point about the slavery, the historian of Baptist, you said he's the only one writing today in this way, whereas 50 years ago there were many people writing about it. It's the same way with the crisis in Marxist studies, that today very few, almost nobody writes like this. Whereas, you know, in the 1958 or 1924, almost everybody was writing, or a lot of people were writing like this, who were Marxists or who were, you know. So I think there's a sort of a crisis in Marxist thought is also on the level of Marxist philosophy,
Of course.
which is what you said in the first lecture, you know.
But I just wonder if it's possible for sort of ways to stop involving, you know, multiple levels to understand capitalist development, for example. You see, okay, understanding the slavery has a very clear effect is one thing, but understanding different mechanism is going on is another, and if we try to merge those things as if that's the main perspective, I think I would like to see some kind of ways to differentiate when to involve these larger wholes. Sometimes, you know,
We'll talk about it next time.
yeah, that's
I mean, what would be a larger whole here? I mean, like spheres of when you refer to
When
a
you
kind
refer
of
to the-
larger whole, what, I'm just curious.
about production processes
Yes,
on the
okay,
one
all
hand,
right.
and analyzing that very clearly,
Right,
and then extend to the exchange realm of exchange.
Right.
Once you begin to extend to the realm of exchange,
Right.
then you go beyond capitalism. You know, exchange.
Well, you
allow
go beyond the old capitalism, you do.
The old capitalism.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
And then,
Yeah.
then we have to differentiate that process in the exchange sphere, and then historicize it in such a way that the
Right.
concept of capitalism is not diluted.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up something interesting here in terms of today's lesson. The Hegelian immediacy, Marx in the immediate processes of production, is really dealing with all this kind of non-reflective, immediate processes there, and then later we'll go back to many levels of mediation in capital, so you see this at work in Marx himself.
But the example of exchange, I think,
Yeah.
brings up just why
Yeah.
it has to be dialectical in terms of couching
Right.
totality.
Right.
Because if you look only at exchange, it seems quite similar to the exchange of,
Right.
pre-capitalist societies. But if you see it in the context of the totality, of course, it is extremely different from those kinds of exchanges, or the function of exchange in those kinds of societies. So I think it always has to be, in that sense, on both levels, the whole and the parts. The whole and the parts. You cannot understand, all our friends think in the same way, Freud, interpretation of dreams, and, Levi Strauss and culture, whatever the case may be, that you cannot understand the significance of any element without understanding its relationship to the whole. And the whole is, of course,
Sometimes
vice
we
versa.
don't know.
Well, to the structure in Levi
Right.
Strauss's case.
Yes.
I don't know. Sometimes we don't know what is the whole, and then that, and then that becomes a problem.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
That's another problem, how to put one's hand on what is the whole as
Yeah.
compared to another version of it.
Right.
But that's not easy. What's interesting is that Marxists all over the world were still studying Capital Volume 1 as if that was a broad description and detailed description as well of capitalism as it is, circa 1960, 70, 80, 90,
The crisis is
2000.
here, Stanley.
And the very decades,
Contradiction.
the very decades
down.
of capitalism is changing. So this guy, Karatani, comes up with the means of exchange as the dominant form
Modes.
of capitalist development. Well, it's dominant form.
Yeah, no, but the modes, he says the modes of exchange.
Modes of exchange, yeah. Modes of exchange, that's true.
The gift and reciprocal economy, yeah.
But we don't have anywhere in the world, as far as I can tell, except maybe small groups here and there, a radical revolutionary movement that is willing to examine Karatani in detail and either agree, disagree, or partially disagree, and take his insights into account in a new discussion of what is capitalism and what are its implications and what are its
I don't think he can
effects.
go there.
What?
He doesn't talk about capitalism. He talks about only about exchange, modes of exchange.
Well, he means
No,
capitalism.
he has a right, yeah. The mode of exchange C is capitalism.
And therefore,
Yeah.
there's no distinction. That's the problem right there.
Are you suggesting that a reading of Karatani might indicate that the idea that workplace democracy, workers' co-ops could be a way out of capitalism?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying it has to be examined. It has to be looked at and what it means.
But if the primacy is on exchange, then the internal relations within the
Right.
unit
Karatani
of production
goes
may be
there. I mean,
secondary to the.
it's Proudhonian mutualism and
That goes back to Proudhon,
Yeah.
to the Israeli radical Borchov.
Yeah.
And, it has a whole history of people. And actually, that was what a lot of the early German people who were in the revolutionary movement actually believed, something close to that.
Yeah, Buber and Gustav Landau.
Landau, who's an anarchist,
Anarchist.
minister of education in the German government of 1918-19. And he was murdered,
Yes.
which is probably why Lukács fled to the Soviet Union, apart from his beliefs. Because many people who stayed in Germany on the ground nach
A lot of
Hitler
people who stayed in France too.
that was the slogan of the German Communist Party was nach Hitler uns.
Right.
Us.
Right.
After Hitler.
That's right. After Hitler us. And all of them got slaughtered except the ones that left.
So what's on the agenda for next week?
6 to 10.
6 to 10, okay. All right. I got it.
You don't listen to
I didn't listen. I didn't hear that. No, I was in some reverie. I was in some dialectical, exaggerated reverie here. Yeah. 6 to 10. All right.
Next week here.
We get to do the materialistic priority of being over conscious.
That's right.
Just search for it and see if you got it.
In the longer term, is the second going to be the last class of this course?
That's up to Stanley.
Okay.
Yeah.